In a small town, water is life. It flows from the ground, is held in trust, and shared by all. It's a symbol of community, of purity, of life itself. But what happens when that trust is broken? What if the very source of life for an entire community became a tomb? The story of Havenwood is a harrowing look into the darkness that can lie dormant beneath the most peaceful surfaces, a darkness that can taint everything. Before we climb the ladder into this terrifying mystery, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to be left in the dark on this one. Havenwood was a town nestled in the fold of an ancient, wooded valley, a place that time seemed to have largely forgotten. It was a community of less than 800 souls, where last names were as old as the towering pine trees and secrets were currency, passed down through generations. The heart of the town wasn't its quaint clapboard church or the single-pump gas station, but the colossal, silver water tank that stood on the highest hill overlooking the valley. It was a silent, stoic guardian, a landmark from which all life in Havenwood flowed. For 70 years, it had held the town's water, drawn from a deep underground spring, pure and cold. It was a constant, a certainty in an uncertain world. Until today, Jebediah Jeb Harris, a man whose wrinkles told the story of 73 Havenwood winters, was the one who found it. For the last 40 years, it had been his job to perform the monthly maintenance check on the tank. His routine was as unchanging as the seasons. He'd drive his sputtering Ford pickup up the winding dirt track, climb the 100-foot steel ladder, his old bones groaning in protest, and inspect the pumps, the seals, and the water level. But this time was different. Even from the base of the ladder, something was wrong. A smell, a faint, cloyingly sweet, and deeply unpleasant odor hung in the humid August air. It was a smell of decay, of something organic gone terribly wrong. He'd smelled dead deer in the woods before, but this was heavier, richer, and nauseatingly different. He spat on the ground, his brow furrowed, and began the long climb, his mind blaming a dead raccoon or a flock of birds that had met an unfortunate end near the vents. As he neared the top, the smell intensified, thick and gagging. He pulled his handkerchief over his nose and mouth, his eyes watering. He reached the narrow catwalk that encircled the tank's roof and made his way to the main access hatch, a heavy steel circle bolted shut. He unlatched the heavy bolts, his breath coming in ragged puffs. As he strained to lift the hatch, a wave of foul-smelling air washed over him, so potent he stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth as he fought back a wave of vomit. He peered into the dark, cavernous interior. The water inside was high, only a few feet from the top, still and dark. But something was breaking the surface. A pale, misshapen mass, bobbing gently in the water. It was large, tangled, and horrifyingly familiar in its form. He saw what looked like a tattered piece of blue fabric, and something pale and white that reminded him of a bone. At first, his mind refused to process it. A log? A bundle of trash illegally dumped? But as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, the shape resolved itself. It was a human body, bloated and disfigured from its time in the water, but unmistakably human. A choked, strangled cry escaped Jeb's throat. He slammed the hatch shut, the clang of metal echoing across the silent valley. He scrambled back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He fumbled for the ladder, his movements clumsy and panicked. His descent was a terrified slide, his hands burning on the steel rungs. He didn't stop until his feet hit the solid, reassuring earth. He stumbled to his truck, his whole body shaking, and fumbled for the old CB radio he kept for emergencies. His voice, when it finally came out, was a cracked, terrified whisper. "Sheriff Brody, you'd better get up to the water tank. Right now. And for God's sake, tell people to stop drinking the water." Sheriff Dale Brody was a man built for a town like Havenwood. He was large, slow-moving, and his approach to law enforcement mostly involved settling disputes over property lines and giving warnings to teenagers caught with beer. In his 20 years as sheriff, the most serious crime he'd ever dealt with was a barn arson. He arrived at the tank 20 minutes later, his face already pale. One look at Jeb's ashen, terrified expression told him this was real. Brody made the climb himself. What he saw sent him down the ladder just as quickly, his face a mask of horror and disbelief. He immediately radioed the state police. This was a murder in Havenwood. And the crime scene was the town's entire water supply. The thought was so monstrous it was hard to comprehend. He ordered his only deputy, a young man named Miller, to go door to door to post notices, to shut off the main valve feeding the town. The water was contaminated, tainted. Within 3 hours, Havenwood was no longer a sleepy, peaceful village. It was a town under siege by fear. The news spread like a virus. Phones rang incessantly. Neighbors gathered in hushed, horrified groups on their lawns. The realization dawned on them all. For days, perhaps weeks, they had been drinking, cooking with, and bathing in water that held a dead body. The very source of their life had become a tomb. Detective Alistair Finch arrived from the state capital that afternoon. He was the antithesis of Havenwood. He was lean, sharp, and wore a tailored gray suit that seemed immune to the dust and humidity. His face was all sharp angles and intelligent, weary eyes that had seen the worst of human nature in the city's dark alleys and forgotten tenements. He stepped out of his unmarked sedan into a wall of oppressive silence, the kind that only falls on a community in collective shock. Sheriff Brody met him, his relief at handing over jurisdiction palpable. "Detective, thank God you're here. We've never seen anything like this." "No one ever has, Sheriff," Finch said, his voice calm and methodical as he surveyed the scene. The area around the tank was now cordoned off with yellow tape, a jarring slash of color against the deep greens and browns of the forest. "Has the body been identified?" "We can't get to it yet," Brody said, shaking his head. "The county's dive team is on its way. They'll have to drain most of the tank to recover." "But Jeb thinks it might be Thomas Weaver." Finch raised an eyebrow. "And who is Thomas Weaver?" "Local landowner. Owns a big tract of land just north of here. A bit of a recluse. Not the most popular man in town, if I'm being honest. Had disputes with just about everyone. But he's lived here his whole life. He's one of us." Brody's voice cracked on the last words. Finch nodded slowly, his gaze drifting from the stoic, silver tank to the small town nestled below. A town of secrets. A victim no one liked. A killer who had committed an act of unimaginable cruelty, not just against one man, but against the entire community. As the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the valley, the dive team finally arrived. The process was slow, grim, and methodical. The powerful pumps hummed to life, draining thousands of gallons of the tainted water onto the hillside. As the water level dropped, the horror inside was slowly revealed. It was indeed a man, dressed in the work clothes of a farmer or laborer. His features were gone, lost to the water and time, but his identity was later confirmed by the dental records on file in his military service documents. Thomas Weaver, age 56, had been found. The news of the confirmed identity was the second shockwave to hit Havenwood. The first was the horror of the discovery itself. The second was personal. Tom Weaver was not just a body, he was a father, a brother, an enemy, a neighbor. His death wasn't an abstract horror anymore. It had a name, and that meant the killer had a name too. The killer was not some random outsider. They were walking among them. That night, for the first time in memory, the people of Havenwood locked their doors. The comforting stillness of the valley was broken, replaced by a new, chilling silence. It was the silence of fear, the silence of a town that knew a monster was living in their midst, and that they had all been drinking from his grave. Detective Finch stood on the hill, the now empty, cavernous water tank looming behind him like a desecrated monument, and knew this would be the most difficult case of his career. He wasn't just hunting a killer. He was navigating a town drowning in its own paranoia and suspicion. Chikchan Roy. Do a trend on Waitatau, de la fin ban chi tit vade du qua kak chuang kan lai. Mwachuang duok emo rong voi doi thoai. Emo tava chiu sao tam elwine and vat. The morning after the discovery, a suffocating blanket of unnatural quiet lay over Havenwood. The usual sounds of life, the distant whine of the lumber mill, the cheerful chatter of neighbors over fences, the rumble of tractors were all absent. They had been replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. At the town's small, two-room municipal building, Detective Alistair Finch had commandeered the council chambers, transforming the folksy room with its oak paneling and quilted wall hangings into the nerve center of a murder investigation. The contrast was stark. The city's grim reality imposed upon the town's pastoral illusion. His temporary partner, Deputy Ben Miller, a young man barely 25 with earnest eyes and a jaw that was perpetually tight with anxiety, was already pinning a large map of the county to a corkboard. Miller was Havenwood born and bred. He knew the tangled network of families and feuds better than any map could show him. "All right, Miller," Finch began, his voice cutting through the silence as he set down a steaming styrofoam cup of coffee. "Let's build a life. Tell me everything there is to know about Thomas Weaver." Miller took a deep breath. "Well, sir, Tom Weaver was hard, like the granite under these hills. His wife, Martha, died of cancer about 10 years back, and he just seemed to get harder after that. He worked his land from sunup to sundown, kept to himself mostly unless you crossed him. And it wasn't hard to cross Tom Weaver." "Enemies?" Finch asked, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "Easier to list the folks who weren't on his bad side," Miller admitted. "He was in a constant state of war over something. Water rights, property lines, hunting access. You name it. Their first visit was to the Caldwell farm, a sprawling, slightly dilapidated property that shared a 2-mile fence line with the Weaver land. Samuel Caldwell, the family patriarch, met them on his porch, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. He was a man carved from old wood, with suspicious eyes and hands as gnarled as oak roots. "Don't need any city police snooping around here," Caldwell grunted before Finch could even introduce himself. "We're just having a word with everyone who knew Mr. Weaver, sir," Finch said, his tone even and unthreatening. "We understand you two had some disagreements." Caldwell spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Disagreements? That son of a bitch was trying to steal my water. Claimed the creek on my land was his rightful property. A feud our grandfathers started, and he was taking it to court, costing me a fortune. A fortune you now don't have to spend," Finch pointed out quietly. The old man's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "I hated the man, detective, with every bone in my body. I'm glad he's dead. But I didn't kill him. We Caldwells may be rough, but we settle things with lawyers or fists, not by poisoning the whole damn town like some kind of coward." The denial was fierce, but the motive hung in the air between them, thick and undeniable. Their next stop was a world away from the Caldwells' rustic pride. A rusty, single-wide trailer sat amidst a collection of junked cars and overgrown weeds on the far edge of the vast Weaver estate. This was the home of Leo Weaver, Thomas's only son and now sole heir. Leo answered the door shirtless, revealing a gaunt frame and arms pockmarked with the faint, telltale tracks of needle use. His eyes were dull, his movements sluggish. The trailer smelled of stale beer and despair. "Yeah? What do you want?" he mumbled, not meeting their gaze. "We need to ask you some questions about your father, Leo," Finch said. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Leo's lips. "Haven't talked to the old bastard in 6 months. He threw me out, said I was a disgrace, said I wouldn't see a dime of his money till he was cold in the ground." Leo's eyes suddenly widened, a flicker of something, greed, panic, igniting in their depths. "Wait, he is dead. That means the land. It's mine." "It would seem so," Finch said, watching him closely. "That's a powerful reason for wanting him out of the way. Where were you last week, Leo?" "Around. Out of town, maybe. I don't know. I don't keep a diary," he said, his defensiveness a flimsy shield. He was a classic suspect. The disowned son with a drug habit and a multi-million-dollar inheritance on the line. He was almost too perfect. The third name on their list was the most surprising, Elias Vance, a two-term town councilman, owner of the lumber mill, and a pillar of the Havenwood community. He was the opposite of Caldwell and Leo Weaver, polished, articulate, and dressed in a crisp button-down shirt in his immaculate office at the mill. "A terrible, terrible tragedy," Vance said, his face a mask of civic concern. "Tom was a difficult man, but he was a part of this town's fabric. We are all diminished by this. Our records show you and Mr. Weaver were silent partners in a logging deal on the northern part of his property," Finch stated, observing Vance's reaction. Vance didn't flinch. "That's correct. A simple business arrangement. We both stood to profit handsomely once the permits cleared." "And were they clearing?" "Bureaucracy, detective. It moves at its own pace," Vance said with a smooth, dismissive wave of his hand. Finch felt a prickle of instinct. Vance was too calm, his answers too rehearsed. There was a lie somewhere behind the polished veneer. He pressed on. "Were there any disagreements? Any environmental concerns?" "None whatsoever," Vance said firmly. "It was a perfectly standard and profitable partnership." That evening, Finch and Miller drove to the town's only diner for a meal. The moment they walked in, the low hum of conversation died. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes was filled with a mixture of fear and suspicion. They sat at a booth, and a nervous teenage waitress took their order in a hushed whisper. Finch tried to engage an old man at the counter. "Evening. Terrible business up on the hill." The man just grunted, staring down into his coffee cup as if it held the answers to the universe. "This is what we're up against," Miller said quietly, after the man had paid and left without another word. "These people, they don't trust outsiders. They've been handling their own problems for 100 years. They see you, they see a threat to that." Back in their makeshift office, the corkboard was now covered with photos and notes. 3 primary suspects, all with powerful motives. Caldwell had the history. Leo had the inheritance. Vance had a business deal that Finch's gut told him was rotten. Yet they had no physical evidence, no witnesses, nothing but a wall of stubborn, fearful silence. Finch stared at the map, at the cluster of houses that made up the town. A small island in a vast sea of woods. "They're protecting him, Ben," Finch said, his voice low. "Or maybe they're just protecting themselves. They're afraid of the truth. One of them knows exactly what happened to Thomas Weaver, and the rest of this town is a closed door. We're not just fighting a killer. We're fighting a whole town." The fear that had taken root in Havenwood began to bloom in ugly and unpredictable ways. Detective Finch, hoping to quell the rising panic and gather information, agreed to a town hall meeting. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The community center, a building normally used for bake sales and bingo nights, was packed to the rafters with angry, terrified residents. The air was thick with the scent of fear, sweat, and simmering resentment. Sheriff Brody stood at the podium, his face glistening with sweat, and tried to deliver a message of calm. "Now, folks, I know we're all upset." "Upset?" a woman shrieked from the back. "We've been drinking corpse water for weeks, Dale. My kids. What is this doing to my kids?" The room erupted. It was no longer a meeting. It was a mob. Accusations flew like stones. Samuel Caldwell and his sons stood on one side of the room, glaring daggers at Leo Weaver, who was hunched in a corner, looking like a cornered animal. "Everyone knows you hated him, Caldwell," someone yelled. "And everyone knows that worthless son of his was just waiting for the old man to die," another shot back. Elias Vance, in his role as councilman, tried to intervene, calling for order and reason, but his smooth voice was drowned out by the raw, primal fear of his constituents. The meeting dissolved into chaos, a portrait of a community tearing itself apart from the inside out. Finch stood at the back of the room, a silent observer, watching as decades of buried resentments and neighborhood squabbles erupted in the face of this shared trauma. The days that followed were worse. The psychological toll was etched on every face. Sarah's Diner, a town institution, sat mostly empty. No one wanted coffee or soup made with town water, even though the supply had been rerouted to a reserve well. Sarah, the owner, moved with a haunted look in her eyes. Mothers were seen hauling cases of expensive bottled water into their homes, viewing their own kitchen taps with terror. Friendships frayed. A casual wave between neighbors was replaced by a quick, suspicious glance. The idyllic image Havenwood presented to the world had been a fragile veneer, and now it was shattered, revealing the paranoia and distrust that lay beneath. Meanwhile, the official investigation was at a standstill. Finch was waiting on the full autopsy report, hoping for any detail that could cut through the wall of silence. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Detective Finch, the medical examiner's voice crackled over the phone. "We've got something for you. Your victim, Mr. Weaver, wasn't a drowning." Finch sat up straighter. "Go on." "He had water in his lungs, yes, but not enough. The primary cause of death was blunt force trauma. A single, powerful blow to the back of the head. He was dead, or at least unconscious and dying, before he ever hit the water. The tank wasn't a murder weapon, detective. It was a coffin. This changed everything. Weaver had been killed somewhere else and then, with considerable effort, hauled up a 100-foot ladder and dumped. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a calculated, cold-blooded act of disposal. The killer had a primary crime scene to protect. Finch immediately expanded the search grid. He wouldn't have carried the body far, he reasoned with Miller. He would have driven it as close as he could get. We're looking for his truck. For 2 days, a search party of state troopers and a few reluctant local volunteers combed the dense woods and logging trails surrounding the water tank. It was Deputy Miller who found it. Tucked away in a thicket of overgrown hemlock trees, 5 miles down a barely used access road, was Weaver's rusty, dented Ford F-150. It had been deliberately hidden. The forensics team descended on the truck like locusts. First, it was a disappointment. The cab was clean, almost too clean. It had been wiped down meticulously, but the killer had made a mistake. Tiny, careless error. Late that night, a young forensics tech was painstakingly examining the passenger side of the bench seat. Using a pair of fine-point tweezers and a high-powered flashlight, she reached deep into the crack between the seat cushion and the backrest. Her tweezers came out holding something small and silver. She placed it in an evidence bag. It was a single earring, delicate, intricately made, in the shape of a feather. Finch stared at the tiny object resting in the sterile plastic bag. It was elegant, feminine. It was utterly out of place in the world of a rough old farmer like Thomas Weaver. It didn't belong to his late wife. Miller had already checked the contents of her old jewelry box. This small, silver feather changed the entire landscape of the investigation. Their 3 main suspects were all men, their motives rooted in the masculine worlds of land, money, and pride. But the earring whispered of a different story, a secret that none of the tight-lipped townspeople had dared to mention. There was a woman at the heart of this. The case hadn't just gotten a new lead. It had been blown wide open. An earring is a small thing, but in a town like Havenwood, it was a signature. Finch knew that brute force investigation wouldn't work here. He needed local knowledge, the kind that wasn't written in any official record. The next morning, he and Miller paid a visit to the Havenwood Post Office, a small building that doubled as the town's unofficial nerve center. Its operator for the past 50 years was Martha Gable, a woman with hair like spun snow and eyes that missed nothing. Finch placed the evidence bag containing the silver feather earring on the worn wooden counter. "Martha, I need you to look at this. Have you ever seen it before?" Martha peered at it through her bifocals, her lips pursed. A flicker of recognition, followed by a deep reluctance, crossed her face. She looked up at Finch, her expression troubled. She was a keeper of secrets, and this was one she clearly did not want to share. "Secrets are getting people killed, Martha," Finch said softly. The old woman sighed, a sound like rustling dry leaves. "Oh my," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's Sarah Vance's, Elias's wife. She had a pair just like it. Wore them to church 2 Sundays ago." The name hit Finch like a physical blow. Elias Vance, the smooth, polished councilman who claimed his relationship with Weaver was purely professional. It was a lie. Profound one. Finch orchestrated the next move with surgical precision. He sent Miller to bring Sarah Vance to the municipal building, while he personally went to the lumber mill to collect Elias. He put them in separate interview rooms. He started with Elias. "Mr. Vance, we need to talk again about your relationship with Thomas Weaver." Elias was the picture of calm cooperation. "Of course, detective. Anything I can do to help." He stuck to his story, denying any personal connection, any conflict, any knowledge beyond their business deal. Finch let him talk, let him build the walls of his lie higher and higher. Then, Finch went into the other room, where Sarah Vance sat twisting a handkerchief in her hands. She was a decade younger than her husband, with a fragile, nervous beauty. Finch didn't speak. He simply placed the evidence bag with the single earring on the table in front of her. Her composure shattered. A strangled sob escaped her lips, and she buried her face in her hands. The confession that followed was a torrent of quiet, desperate misery. Their finances were in ruins. Elias, obsessed with keeping up appearances, had hidden the extent of their bankruptcy from her, from everyone. She felt trapped, lonely. Thomas Weaver, for all his roughness, had offered her an escape. He'd listened to her, made her feel seen. The affair had been going on for 3 months. "That night," she wept, "the night he died, I was with him. I went to his truck to tell him I couldn't do it anymore, that I felt too guilty. We argued. I must have dropped it then. I swear, detective, he was alive when I left him." Her confession was the key. Finch walked back into Elias Vance's room. "Your wife has been very helpful, Mr. Vance. She's confessed to the affair. She's placed herself in Thomas Weaver's truck on the night he was murdered. Your alibi, that you were home with her all evening, is a lie." The blood drained from Elias's face. His smooth facade crumbled, revealing the terrified, desperate man beneath. He stared at Finch, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. "It's over, Elias," Finch said, his voice hard. "Tell me what happened." "I didn't kill him," Elias finally choked out, his voice cracking. "I swear to God, I knew about the affair. I followed her that night. I waited until she left, and then I went to confront him. He was at his old hunting cabin, deep in the woods. He laughed in my face. He called me a pathetic failure who couldn't even keep his own wife happy. I lost it." Elias buried his head in his hands. "We fought. I grabbed a fireplace poker. I hit him hard. But he was alive. He was groaning, trying to get up when I ran. I just panicked. I've been lying to protect myself. I'm a coward, but I'm not a murderer." It was a stunning confession, and it gave Finch the final, missing piece of the puzzle, the true primary crime scene. Within the hour, Finch and a forensics team were at the secluded hunting cabin, a dilapidated structure miles from anywhere. The place was thick with dust, but the signs of a struggle were clear. A heavy iron poker lay by the hearth, and on the old bearskin rug, forensics found a dark stain that tested positive for human blood. Elias had been telling the truth about the fight. But as the team conducted a thorough search, they found something else. Under a loose floorboard near the fireplace was a small tin box. It was not a new box. It was rusted at the edges, clearly hidden there for a very long time. Finch pried it open. Inside was a collection of yellowed, brittle letters, tied with a faded ribbon, and a single black and white photograph. Finch carefully unfolded one of the letters. The handwriting was a looping, feminine script. They were love letters dated 40 years prior, and they were signed by Eleanor Vance, Elias's revered, church-going mother. As he read on, the contents grew darker. The letters spoke of a terrible secret, a panicked confession to her then-lover. She had been driving home late one night, had struck a child who had darted out onto the road, and in a moment of sheer terror, had hidden the body and driven away. A hit-and-run that was never solved. Then Finch looked at the photograph. It showed a young boy, no older than 15, with Thomas Weaver's familiar sullen eyes, peering through the trees, a silent witness to a long-buried crime. The final letter confirmed the horrifying truth. Eleanor wrote of the Weaver boy, who had seen everything, and the money she had to give him to ensure his silence. Finch stood up, the old letters in his hand. The entire case reconfigured itself in his mind with horrifying clarity. This murder was never about a land dispute, or a tawdry affair, or an inheritance. It was about a secret 40 years old. Thomas Weaver wasn't a victim. He was a blackmailer. And Elias Vance, in his desperation, wasn't just protecting himself from an assault charge. He was protecting his mother from a charge of manslaughter. Or so he thought. Finch had a sickening feeling that the story was even darker than that. The Vance family home was one of the oldest in Havenwood, a stately white colonial with a porch that wrapped around it like a loving embrace. It was a house that projected an image of stability, grace, and unimpeachable morality. When Detective Finch's sedan pulled into the gravel driveway, he didn't ask for Elias or Sarah. He asked to see Eleanor. He found her in a sunlit parlor, sitting in a rocking chair by the window, a half-finished knitted blanket in her lap. She was a small, bird-like woman in her late 70s, with kind, wrinkled eyes and hair as white as cotton. She looked up at him and offered a serene, gentle smile, as if she had been expecting him. "Detective," she said, her voice calm and clear. "Please come in. Can I offer you some tea?" "No, thank you, Mrs. Vance," Finch said. He walked over and, without a word, placed the faded black and white photograph of the young Thomas Weaver on the small table beside her knitting basket. Her hands, which had been moving with practiced rhythm, went still. Her smile did not falter, but a profound, ancient weariness settled into her eyes, extinguishing their light. She didn't deny it. She didn't gasp or cry. The time for lies was over. She began to speak, her voice a soft, steady monotone, as if she were recounting a story that had been replayed in her mind 1,000,000 times. She told him about that night 40 years ago. The rain, the slick road, the terrible, sickening thud, the child, the panic that had clawed at her, the terror of losing her husband, her son, her place in the world, and she told him about the boy in the woods who had seen it all. "Thomas Weaver," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He was a cruel boy who grew into a cruel man. Started small, a few dollars to fix his bike, then more for a car. Over the years, it became a pension, a tax on my soul for one moment of unforgivable cowardice." She explained how, when Thomas learned of her son Elias's financial troubles, he saw his final opportunity. He had delivered an ultimatum, a payment of $50,000, everything she had left her. He would go to the police and destroy the Vance family name forever. "I knew I couldn't pay it," she said, her gaze distant, "and I could not let him ruin my son. Elias is a good man. He has worked so hard. I could not let my sin become his downfall." So she had arranged the meeting at the old cabin, under the pretense of giving him the money. She knew he loved a particular brand of expensive whiskey. She had brought a new, sealed bottle, which she had painstakingly opened, injected with a massive, lethal dose of her potent heart medication, and then resealed. "Elias's fight with him earlier that day was a coincidence," she explained. "A terrible, unfortunate coincidence. When I arrived, Thomas was angry, his head was bleeding slightly, but he was very much alive. He was thirsty. He drank the whiskey I offered him. He thought he had won." She paused, her eyes finally meeting Finch's. "He was dead within minutes. It was quite peaceful, really. A heart attack, just like the coroner first thought." Her son Elias, frantic with worry about his wife and his own violent confrontation, had arrived at the cabin an hour later to try and make amends with Weaver. Instead, he found his mother sitting calmly beside a dead body. In that moment, driven by a lifetime of fierce, protective love, Elias made a decision. He believed his own blow with the poker had killed Weaver, and that his mother was only trying to protect him by being there. He concocted the desperate, insane plan to hide the body. He was the one who, under the cover of darkness, single-handedly hauled Thomas Weaver's body up that 100-foot ladder and pushed it into the water tank. He was not covering up his mother's crime. He thought he was covering up his own. It was a tragic, fatal misunderstanding born of two interlocking secrets. The arrests were as quiet and somber as the confession. Eleanor Vance, the town's moral compass, was led from her beautiful home without resistance. Her son, Elias, his face a mask of broken devastation, confessed to his role in the cover-up, finally understanding the true, terrible nature of the secret he had been protecting his entire life. Weeks later, a fragile peace had settled over Havenwood, but it was the peace of a graveyard. The silver water tank, now scrubbed, sanitized, and refilled, gleamed in the autumn sun, but no one looked at it the same way. It was no longer a symbol of life, but a monument to a dark and buried past. Finch stood on the hill one last time before driving back to the city. He had come to Havenwood to find a killer who had tainted the town's water. But he had discovered that the town had been poisoned long before that. It had been poisoned by a secret, a lie that had festered for 40 years, passed down through whispers, and paid for in blood. The fear of a killer in their midst had faded, but it had been replaced by something far more corrosive. The knowledge of the darkness that could hide behind the most familiar, trusted faces. The stillness had returned to Havenwood, but it was no longer the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of a wound that would never truly heal.